see is you. I should have been on your mind, but you're holding it back. The only thing we're losing is time. We could be cruising in heaven. I know these things take time. Let's go get it back. You said that you love it when you're with me, so let's get with it tonight. Baby, this ain't temporary. I know that we're ready. I'm not worried about the rain or when the seasons change or it's cold outside. I won't feel anything. There won't come a day I don't feel this way. So don't worry, baby. Just hear me, darling. You're good with me. You're good with me. You're good with me. Baby, you're good. May not be on your line, but you're calling me back. Don't be too far into all of it, right at the heart of it, to you and I. If we could reason, seeing all that we would have to leave behind. Let's quit waiting on the feeling of something we're believing tonight. Oh, you know that, baby, this ain't temporary. I know that we're ready. I'm not worried about the rain or when the seasons change. If it's cold outside, I won't feel anything. There won't come a day I don't feel this way. So don't worry, baby. Just hear me, darling. You're good with me. You're good with me. You're good with me. Baby, you're good. Oh, not worried about the rain or when the seasons change. If it's cold outside, I won't feel anything. There won't come a day I don't feel this way. So don't worry, baby. Just hear me, darling. You're good with me. You're good with me. One shot and I give my all. Two words that become home. Three words that mean it all. You catch me when I fall. One shot and I give my all. Two words that become home. Three words that mean it all. You catch me when I fall. When we're not sleeping, this is my dream. You mean everything to me. You mean everything to me. Midnight's a big creeping, but I thought I'd scream. Would you be my dancing queen? Would you be my ecstasy? You chasing night, all up to high, looking for the chance of romance. Oh, out of sight, to watch you fly, left me burning on the getaway. One shot and I give my all. Two words that become home. Three words that mean it all. You catch me when I fall. One shot and I give my all. Two words that become home. Three words that mean it all. You catch me when I fall. When we're not sleeping, this is my dream. You mean everything to me. You mean everything to me. Midnight's a big creeping, but I thought I'd scream. Would you be my dancing queen? Would you be my ecstasy? When we're not sleeping, this is my dream. You mean everything to me. You mean everything to me. Midnight's a big creeping, but I thought I'd scream. Would you be my dancing queen? Would you be my ecstasy? I've been on the verge of breaking. Couldn't find my way out of here. I saw you standing there waving, making all this hell disappear. You are my holy water. You are my river deep. Wash me away and take me high. 'Cause something about your love just sets me free. Something about your love just sets me free. I have my time being reckless, holding back my heart for too long. All those empty nights made me helpless, and I was fading like the end of a song. You are my holy water. You are my river deep. Wash me away, take me high. 'Cause something about your love just sets me free. Something about your love just sets me free. Oh, I got used to broken hearts, watching my world fall apart. Didn't know I needed you, but now I do, now I do. Oh, sets me free. If you let me love you like I wanna, I'll give you the ocean, heal you like Logan. If you let me love you like I wanna, write you all the poems like Whitman. You can take my thin mints. If you let me love you like I wanna, I'll give you the ocean, heal you like Logan. If you let me love you like I wanna, write you all the poems like Whitman. You can take my thin mints. All I've ever wanted is to be around you, darling. Think about it, who can make you smile like a safe room when you need that hush like soundproof. Come through and let your mind go quiet. All I've ever wanted is to get to know you, darling. Think about it, who can get you riled up. Downtime's better spent with someone who can hold you so true. I'll set your mind on fire. Now give me one good reason why you're not here now. Cold rationality gets so freezing when you're drowning in fear. If you let me love you like I wanna, I'll give you the ocean, heal you like Logan. If you let me love you like I wanna, write you all the poems like Whitman. You can take my pen mints. If you let me love you like I wanna, I'll give you the ocean, heal you like Logan. If you let me love you like I wanna, write you all the poems like Whitman. You can take my pen mints. You make me.
Well, g'day. Let me welcome you here tonight, whether you're here in person, it's good to see so many people here, or whether you are tuning in online. I'm Charles, I'm one of the pastors here at Grace City. Summer Nights Captive Minds is all about exploring the interaction between culture and Christianity in a way that neither retreats from culture into a holy huddle, nor is taken captive by it and we lose our distinctiveness. Tonight is our third and final night of Summer Nights in this current series, and tonight our speaker is Rob Smith. Now, Rob has done ministry in a number of churches across Sydney over a number of years, but has most recently taken up a full-time role as a lecturer at SMBC, Sydney Missionary and Bible College. He's very close to finishing a PhD, exploring a Christian response to transgenderism. And I've heard his stuff on it, and it's very, very good. Rob has also written a number of books and articles at both a popular and an academic level across a very broad range of topics, ranging from kind of music through to theology, and even our topic for tonight, which is cultural Marxism, which I trust Rob will explain. But Rob is also a kind and a godly man, and I have a lot of personal respect for him. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say to us tonight. And our aim in this is to generate constructive discussion, to have a conversation, to ask questions and explore things together, and maybe learn and grow together. So to that end, we are going to be doing a Q&A as we have for the last couple of weeks. So there's a QR code. You can scan that now. That'll take you through to an app where you can submit questions, and you can kind of do that as we go. But that QR code will also come up when we go to our Q&A time after Rob finishes. But for now, let me welcome Rob Smith.
Charles, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and a joy to address you in the room and those who are watching in via the live stream. Charles has asked me to push you tonight, and so I've prepared a fairly dense lecture. That's really what it is. It's not a Bible study. We're not actually going to open the Bible, I'm sorry to say. Could do that another time with you, but this is largely a historical study, but with contemporary relevance and application, as you'll see. But again, I hope you'll find it interesting, and I hope that it'll generate a whole lot of valuable questions in the question time. So my essential task is to shed light on this phenomenon that people often call cultural Marxism, We want to see what it is. We want to see what it isn't. We want to understand where it's come from. We want to get a handle on how it's making its presence felt in our contemporary world. And then most importantly of all, what we want to do as Christians is to, well, think through how should we regard it and how should we respond to it. Okay, so that's really the shape and the plan for tonight. If you're in the room, you've got a hard copy of a handout you can follow. At least they're up the back if you want to grab one. And I think if you're on the live stream, this is available somehow. Charles is nodding. No, it's not available to you. Sorry. But Charles can send it to you because I sent it to him. All right, well, let's dive in. In the last decade or so, cultural Marxism has become something what is often called a boo hooray term. That is, whenever it's heard, it elicits some boos and perhaps some hoorays. It's a word or a term that provokes a kind of visceral reaction of one kind or another, denunciation or celebration, disgust or delight, right? It's a divisive expression in that sense. Now, from one point of view, that's a really odd thing. It's a rather curious thing because the term's been around for decades. It's been well used, it's there in the literature, it's in book titles, article titles, it's discussed by authors in a dispassionate way, sometimes in a favorable way. And yet, all of a sudden, it's this explosive, toxic term that Wikipedia had an entry on it some years back, and about 2014, I think they removed it or something, and such was the heat around it. But what is it? What is it in a nutshell? Well, cultural Marxism is simply a way of referring to a 20th century development in Marxist thought. And to be more precise, it's a development that came to see culture as a key source of human oppression. Right? Not just social status or economics, but culture itself. Okay, so cultural Marxism is really nothing more than the application of Marxist theory to culture. Now, I will unpack that as we go along, so don't sort of stop at this point and think, well, okay, but that doesn't tell me very much. Well, I'll tell you a whole lot more soon. But let's just ask the why the commotion question, which is on the outline if you've got the outline. Why the commotion around this term? Well, basically, this expression, cultural Marxism, has come in the last 20 years or so to function as a kind of shorthand for left-wing ideology. That's basically what it's saying. Left-wing ideology, particularly as it's currently manifesting itself in a range of progressive political developments and what we tend to now call woke social developments, social causes, justice causes, and so on. And consequently, most people who would see themselves on what you might call the left side of the culture war, when they hear the term cultural Marxism, they hear it as a snarl word, right, as an accusation, and of course often it can be. And so they tend to react to it and dismiss it and say it doesn't exist, or, well, here's some on the slide you'll see. Some people call it a uniting theory for right-wingers who love to play the victim. Someone else has called it a conspiracy theory with an anti-Semitic twist. And someone else has called it the ultimate post-factual dog whistle. Okay, so these are reactions, again, these are boo reactions. But they're also dismissive reactions, saying that we don't believe this exists, or if it does, it's just a conspiracy theory dreamt up by right-wing fascists or something of the kind. So, what are we to do with all that? Who are we to believe? What are we to make of this term? Is it useful to us? Is it helpful? Is it accurate? Is it a misnomer? Is it a conspiracy theory? And if there are conspiracy theory versions, what do we do about those? And, well, that's our hope, to try and sort out some of this stuff tonight. Now, to answer these questions, we actually need to go back to, well, the beginning of, I guess, the Marxist tradition, and that is into what's called classical Marxism. So, if you've got the handout, we're now at heading number 1, Understanding Classical Marxism, beginning with, of course, Karl Marx. Now, you'll see his dates there, 1818 to 1883. Karl Marx, as a university student, became a disciple, really, of a philosophy professor who had died before he got to university, but had been at the university where he was studying. That philosopher's name was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Hegel for short. And Marx was very impacted by Hegel. He embraced his ideology at a very deep level, and he in particular took hold of the idea of Hegel's that history follows a natural and inevitable process. Right? History is going somewhere and cannot help but go somewhere. But over time, Marx, came to differ with Hegel in a key respect. In contrast to Hegel's what was called dialectical idealism, and if you want me to explain that in a nutshell, it's basically the idea that matter is dependent upon mind and that history is the kind of progressive self-realization of an absolute mind, God. Well, Marx said no. Marx proposed what was later called dialectical, not idealism, but dialectical materialism. And again, in a nutshell, that's the view that matter is primary, not mind, matter, and that change is inherent not in some idealistic process, but in the material process, right? In material reality itself. And so it's for this reason that Marx is said, and in fact said himself, that he turned Hegel upside down, or in his words, turned him right side up. Now, if all of that's a little bit lost on you, don't worry, just hold on to that. But Marx is a dialectical materialist as opposed to Hegel, a dialectical idealist. Okay, matter over mind. Now, two factors then helped to facilitate the application of Marx's ideas to economic theory. The first was his association with a movement called the Paris Commune, again, a communist or socialist movement in Paris, out of which grew a lifelong friendship with his, working partner and collaborator, Friedrich Engels. And so you've often perhaps heard of Marx and Engels. They co-wrote the Communist Manifesto, as we'll see shortly. Then the second thing that I guess pushed Marx towards applying his philosophy to economics was capitalism and the Industrial Revolution and all the things that took place in the early stages and phases of industrial capitalism. There was a whole lot there to, not only observe, but to be concerned about. Working conditions were frequently dangerous for people. They were often unhealthy. Working arrangements were often cruel and exploitative, and there was concern for children and their welfare, and so there were genuine problems that needed to be addressed. And so Marx saw that there was a place for his theory, as it were, to speak into this situation. Now, all of that led him to see the fundamental human problem in terms of, there's a key word here, oppression. Human beings are oppressed, or at least some are oppressed by others. Some are oppressors and others are repressed. But the problem as it manifests is one of oppression. And that, he said, was the inevitable consequence of living in a society where there was a capitalist class, which he called, anyone know, the bourgeoisie, right? That's the term he used out of the Paris Commune lingo, where the owners of production, right, the business owners, those who own the machinery, and so they basically use the workers, the working class, the proletariat, use them to make profits for themselves. And how do they do that? Well, they either underpay the workers, or they kind of overinflate the value of the products, but either way, they are oppressing the workers. And that oppression then leads to an experience, another key word for Marx, an experience of alienation. Okay, so oppression leads to alienation, fourfold alienation, said Marx. First, from the act of production, the worker is, as it were, cut off from the work of his hands. Second, from the product made. Third, from other workers. And finally, from him or herself. Okay, so this is Marx's diagnosis of what's wrong with the world, you might say. Oppression leading to alienation. Okay, so what's the solution according to Marx? How do you fix this problem? Well, Marx was a dialectical materialist. And he was convinced that the capitalist system actually contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction, that it would inevitably fall over and fail and self-destruct. Continued exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie would have inevitably lead to mounting resentment, right, among the oppressed, which would then eventually boil over into a proletarian revolution. And out of that revolution, a whole new society would emerge. A classless society, in fact, would emerge. Now, Marx anticipated that this would be a violent process. In fact, he saw violence as necessary to the protest. In fact, he encouraged violence and spoke of it frequently and glowingly. And here's an example just on the slide I'm about to put up here from the Communist Manifesto, which he and Engels wrote in 1848. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims, says the manifesto. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. And so the great closing line of the manifesto, working men of all countries, unite, right? This was the great rallying cry. Now, supposedly, all the bloodshed would be worth it, and it would produce the desired result. And in the wake of capitalism's demise and the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, this new classless society would appear, and it would indeed be governed by a principle. Here it is. Here's the key principle. You've probably heard it. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Okay, so everyone contributes what they're able, and everyone receives exactly what they need. Sounds a lovely idea. Furthermore, in this society, all lands, all industry, labor, wealth, everything would be held in common, not privately owned, held in common, and then freely shared and, well, partaken in by everybody. And this is why the Communist Manifesto also claims that the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Sorry, there it is. I've now got the slide for you. Abolition of private property. That's the single sentence. Now, there's a whole lot more could be said about classical Marxism, but they're the key things that you need to know for tonight's purposes. But I want to move on to the next question, which is, whoops, we don't need that slide. The next question, which is basically, what is Marx's legacy? How did this work out? What's happened as a consequence of this theory being put into practice? And the short answer is terrible things. Marx's legacy is utterly appalling. Right? Everywhere, and I do mean everywhere, his ideas were implemented, whether Russia, China, Cambodia, Cuba, Burma, the Congo, East Germany, North Korea, Venezuela, several more. Everywhere, the results have been nothing short of catastrophic. Dystopian, not utopian, as was promised. And, well, again, it's hard to know the exact body count that the Marxist experiments of the 20th century produced, but it's somewhere around 100 million people. Furthermore, attempts to exonerate Marx as if the problems only have to do with corruptions of his philosophy, if it's just never been tried properly, that kind of thing. Sorry, no, that's tragically naive. True, Marx was not personally responsible for Stalin's Gulag or Mao's Cultural Revolution or Pol Pot's killing fields, okay, but his ideas were. These were incarnations of his ideas. For once you abolish private property and replace it with state control of kind of everything, well, not only does that kind of deprive society of the incentives that actually drive things forward, but people are robbed of what is rightfully theirs, and surprise, surprise, other freedoms then start to disappear, and the end result is, in every case, totalitarian. So somebody said in the interview I was listening to the other day, and someone who's actually quite favourably disposed towards Marxism said the problems are baked into the cake from the ground up. And yet, here's the really curious thing. Marx was voted thinker of the millennium, and his reputation survives and, in fact, is growing, particularly amongst millennials and post-millennials. And so there are lots of articles popping out that Marx is on the way back. His reputation is increasing. I'll just give you one brief anecdote. I was in a bookshop, well, it's probably a year ago now, because it was kind of the second lockdown, I think. I was in a bookshop in town, and must have been about this time, because it was school holidays still. There were a group of schoolgirls milling around a book table just a few metres away from me. And one of them said, oh, I see the word communism, very excited. And another one said, oh, I'm in, like this. I'm thinking, I guess they haven't studied modern history yet. At least I'm hoping they haven't studied modern history yet. Because if you've studied even a little bit of modern history, that's not a fitting response. Okay, communism has routinely promised heaven on earth, and yet it every time delivers the opposite. And here's the thing, in the early part of the 20th century, particularly in that what we call the interwar period, right between the wars, after the First World War, some of Marx's most ardent disciples had already figured this out and were, well, not only, I guess, calling him things like a false prophet, but they were trying to work out, how do we fix Marxism? how do we, as it were, find the good bits, if there are good bits, and get the ship back on course. Okay, so that then brings me to the second thing we want to look at, which is the neo-Marxism of Antonio Gramsci. Okay, the neo-Marxism of Antonio Gramsci, and there's a picture of him. Now, Gramsci, he became the head of the Italian Communist Party in 1924, and was a very, powerful thinker, writer, speaker, and much feared by Mussolini, who, although he had been a socialist at one point, once he sort of came into power, he was keen to stamp out the socialists and the communists, and so on Mussolini's orders, Gramsci was arrested, convicted, sent to the island prison of Ustica for 8 years. And, after he was released in 1934, he was very weakened by the whole experience and only lived for a few more years. But during those 8 years in prison, he wrote furiously, copiously, and the net result was what are now called the prison notebooks. And they have had an incredible effect upon subsequent generations, even though it took a little while for them to kind of be compiled and get translated and get out and about. But they certainly did get out and about. So we need to understand something of this man, Antonio Gramsci, and what happens to Marxism in his hands. So we've introduced him. What's his diagnosis of the problem? Well, according to Gramsci, the main reason Marxism had failed lay in the persistence of capitalist ideas embedded in the institutions of civil society. Now, what's he thinking of here? He's thinking of things like the family, churches, clubs, voluntary associations, charities, and so on. Right? These are, the institutions or organizations of civil society. In other words, it was the culture of Western society that was actually blocking the proletarian uprising that Marx had promised would come and had to come. As Gramsci wrote in his notebooks, or one of them at least, he said, the state was only an outer ditch behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses. Okay, so he picked up Marx's idea. Marx was a big fan of the abolition of the family because he saw the family as, private property was all bound up with the family, and they both had to go, And yeah, this is one of the civil institutions that's blocking the way. It's one of the fortresses that needs to be overcome. Furthermore, the social and relational fortresses, Gramsci figured out, were actually inseparable from the West's Christian heritage. And so what did he conclude? Well, he concluded that until Christianity's cultural hegemony, and that was a key word for him, hegemony, right, its stranglehold, as it were, Christianity's cultural hegemony, until that's broken, these natural consensus creating structures of society are not going to give way, and the communist revolution, therefore, not going to come. Now, all of that required a major rethink of Marx, of course, because Gramsci realized that if you want to change the economic structures of society, which Marx thought would inevitably change, well, no, he realized that they're not going to inevitably change. You actually have to change the cultural institutions that socialize people into believing and behaving according to the dictates, so to speak, of the capitalist system. And he figured out the only way to do that was to cut the Judeo-Christian roots of Western civilization. Right? Because these roots nourish the capitalist system. So you've got to cut those roots and de-Christianize. So, this is Gramsci's solution. Now, how might he pull it off? Well, his strategy was to basically get into operation an army of Marxist intellectuals who would undertake what one of his kind of disciples called, a guy called Rudi Dutschke, he called the long march through the institutions of power. Okay, you may have heard that expression, but that's where it comes from. It comes from Rudi Dutschke, who, again, was a Gramscian disciple who said this is basically Gramsci's strategy, the long march through the institutions of power. That is, what needs to happen is the gradual colonizing and ultimate controlling of all the key institutions of society. Here's how Gramsci himself put it. He said, in the new order, socialism will triumph first by capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. So the program, at least in theory, is therefore very simple. You subvert society by changing its culture, and you change the culture by infiltrating the institutions. Okay, hence the long march through the institution, because this doesn't happen overnight. It's got to happen incrementally. And the goal is likewise clear. Destroy capitalism and replace it with a communist counter-hegemony. Okay, in other words, seize control, but a different kind of control. Now, this is why many people see cultural Marxism as a very accurate description of Gramsci's philosophy. And again, it's been used very favorably as a label to say this is exactly what he's done and exactly what he's commending. Right? A cultural twist on classical Marxism with a view to the transformation of culture and therefore everything else. Now, if we dig into the details just a little bit further and deeper, Gramsci was clear that the New World Order would necessarily involve the destruction of all hierarchies. And the goal was not just, as it were, a kind of flattening of the system, but a flipping of the system. In other words, oppressors would now need to become the oppressed. Those who were formerly privileged would need to have their privileges taken away. And above all, Christianity would need to be replaced by a new religion. Now, what's that new religion that he had in mind? Well, the new religion is socialism. Here's how he puts it. Socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity. It is a religion, he says, in the sense that it too is a faith, and because it is substituted for the consciousness of the transcendental God of the Catholics, remember he's in Italy, Okay, so it's a Catholic country. Trust in man and his best strengths as the sole spiritual reality. Now, that song was written by Karl Marx. It's not new for Gramsci. Right? Marx had a theology. He had a religion. It was humanism. Right? That man created God, and indeed man creates himself. That's key and at the heart of Marx's thought. Well, Gramsci's running with that as well. Moreover, the God of this new religion, whom Gramsci calls the Prince, which is a term he borrows from, anyone know? Machiavelli. Okay, that's where he gets that term from Machiavelli. Well, the God, the Prince, is none other than the Communist Party. Here's how he puts it in Notebook 8. He says, the Prince takes the place in the people's consciousness of the divinity, that's God, and of the categorical imperative, right? That's what's right and wrong. It becomes the basis of a modern secularism and of a complete secularization of all of life and of customary relationships. New religion, new God. Right? The state becomes God, or at least the party becomes God. And secularism, in the form of communism, is the new religion. Now, again, let's think about Gramsci's influence. How do we evaluate that? Well, I think it's safe to say that we are everywhere today surrounded by, as someone's put it, signs of Gramsci's ghost. You know, whether it's the rise of victimhood culture, which is kind of today's version of class consciousness, or experiments in identity politics, which basically destroy human commonalities and create, well, tribal factions. Or this new philosophy of intersectionality, which creates a new inverted hierarchy where the most oppressed are actually at the top rather than the bottom. Or in the shaming and blaming of the privileged, which again is vital, creating this new periphery-centered society, as Gramsci called it. Well, as I said, we see Gramsci everywhere, even though we may not realize it's him. Here's how one writer named Alexander Zubotov has put it. It is a short step from Gramsci's hegemony to the now ubiquitous toxic memes of patriarchy, heteronormativity, white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, and whiteness. In other words, if you are a white, English-speaking, property-owning Christian male who's cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, and good-looking as well, I'm not looking at you, Tim. Basically, if you're in any or all of those blue boxes, if you can see that slide, you've got a problem, right? You've got way too many privilege points, and the more points you have, the more you are condemned, because the more you are an oppressor, even if you don't want to be. And so if we were to update this very famous poster, I don't know if you've ever seen it before, came out in 1911. It's called Industrial Workers of the World. The structure would remain the same, right, with capitalism, or at least power at the top of the tree, the pyramid as it is. But the people underneath have changed somewhat, or at least been added to, okay? So those with the most power are now not just the wealthy, but, the heterosexual, the able-bodied, white men. And those with the least power, not just the poor, but the homosexual, the disabled, and particularly women of color. But the Gramscian goal is the same. Flip the pyramid. Okay. Inversion. A periphery-centered society. And so here's a diary that I saw online. Maybe you've got one, I don't know. Right, it's a new sort of woke cultural Marxist diary that sends its own message, and lest you're tempted to poke fun at it, which, well, I guess I feel that temptation. But here's the thing, and we'll come back to this later. It's not entirely wrong. that is, our world is full of injustice, inequities, oppression, exploitation. And, well, many of these things can be all of those things. The question, however, is what is the best way to go about addressing the problems of our world? Is it really just to smash the system or flip the system or detonate the system, or is there a better way? Well, hold that thought because we will come back to it. But let's move on to phase 3, the Frankfurt School. Now, Gramsci, I think, is rightly called the sort of the pioneer of cultural Marxism, but he's not the only person who's thinking these kinds of thoughts. And so further north, up in Germany, you have a group of people who in 1923 formed the Institute for Social Research in the city of Frankfurt, hence its more common name, the Frankfurt School. Now, in its early few years, under its first director, it kind of went in a kind of classical Marxist direction, but all of that changed in 1930 when there's the school. It's not a particularly appealing building, but there you go. In 1930, a man named Max Horkheimer, who looks like that, or looked like that, he took over as director, and he took it in a, well, different direction. And so here's what one historian of the Frankfurt School says about that. He says, if it can be said that in the early years of its history, the Institute concerned itself primarily with an analysis of bourgeois society's socio-economic substructure, in the years after 1930, its primary interests lay in its cultural superstructure. Indeed, the traditional Marxist formula regarding the relationship between the two was brought into question by critical theory. Now, we'll come back to critical theory and say more about that shortly, but just in brief, critical theory is basically, well, it's something that Max Horkheimer pioneered. It's a form of biting sort of social analysis aimed at tearing down institutions that sustain capitalism and stand in the way of communism. That's basically what critical theory is all about. It kind of grew out of a, well, not a throwaway comment by Karl Marx, but a comment in Marx's famous theses on Feuerbach. Feuerbach was a German philosopher, and in one of the theses on Feuerbach, Marx said this. He said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Okay, so critical theory was seen as a necessary step toward change, right, by criticizing and analyzing and breaking down the things that supposedly were wrong. Now, to come back to Horkheimer and his project to help in the task of, well, not only developing the Frankfurt School, but also pushing forward with his critical theory, he recruited a range of up-and-coming Marxist intellectuals. Most notably, have I got him there? No. Come back. There we go. He's on the screen already. Herbert Marcuse, who we'll say more about shortly, and another man named Theodor Adorno, who I don't think I've given you his picture. No, he's more cuddly looking, but very clever. Adorno was a genius. Seriously, he was this multidisciplinary genius. But we don't have time to talk about him tonight. But basically what these men did, Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and others, there were quite a number of people employed by the school, was to try to blend classical Marxist doctrines with Darwinian sociology and Freudian psychology. Okay, so again, it was a deliberately interdisciplinary school, and people like Adorno were interdisciplinary people. But that was the aim, to bring together the insights of Marxian doctrine with Darwinian sociology, Freudian psychology. And the aim was to produce a kind of new synthesized form of Marxism that would do the job that classical Marxism had failed to do. Right? In other words, to transform Western culture and pave the way for communist utopia. That's the hope. And, well, for a few years all was going well until 1933. What happened in 1933? The Nazis. Okay, they came to power and, well, The Nazis not only were opposed to the communists, but also anti-Jewish. The members of the Frankfurt School, almost all of them at least, were not only communists, but also Jewish. And they were advised and took the advice to flee the country, initially going to Geneva, I think, but then eventually settling in the US, in New York City, first of all. And there they stayed for about 18 years in moving about and doing different things. It wasn't until 1951 that the school then relocated back in Frankfurt again. But there was one member who stayed behind, and we had him before. Where was he? Oh, I'm going the wrong way. There he is, Herbert Marcuse. Okay, so he's the guy we're about to focus on, because the significance of Marcuse, well, is something we need to appreciate. Now, Marcuse was convinced that for cultural liberation to be complete, sexual liberation was critical. Right? For cultural liberation to be complete, sexual liberation was critical. And this was the case he sought to make in the book whose title you'll see there, Eros and Civilization. 1955 is when it first came out. And its subtitle was A Political Inquiry into Freud. And so again, you see here this desire to bring sort of neo-Marxian ideas with neo-Freudian ideas into some sort of synthesis. Now, the main thesis of Eros and Civilization is that the only way for human beings to escape the dehumanizing effects of advanced industrial society is for our erotic side to be set free. And that means casting off restraint in favor of what he called polymorphous perversity. Polymorphous perversity. Now, that was a term that he borrowed from Freud. So it wasn't original to him. But it's really important to understand what Freud meant by the term and how he used it. So here's Freud. Freud says what makes an infant characteristically different from every other stage of human life is that the child is polymorphously perverse, is ready to demonstrate any kind of sexual behavior with any kind of pleasure without any kind of restraint. Now, there's all kinds of problems in Freud that we won't go into tonight. But the thing is, Freud, at least in his favor, would say the child is not meant to stay like that. The child is meant to grow past that, grow through that. The child needs to mature. The child needs to be civilized. And such civilizing can only really occur after the child's polymorphous perversity is kind of restrained and rechanneled into healthier and more productive avenues. Okay, so at least that's where Freud was going. But you can guess where Marcuse is going. He's going the other way. He wants to say, no. True sexual liberation involves not a disciplining of our polymorphous desires, but their indulgence. As he put it, the goal is to make. Now, did I give you the slide or not? Not sure where that's come in. Anyway, he said the goal was to make the human body an instrument of pleasure rather than of labor. Yeah, okay, that one doesn't need to be there. Now, for instance, it's little wonder, is it, that he had a major influence on the sexual revolution and in particular the gay liberation movement. And so he's often held up as a champion of both of those things. But here's the other lasting contribution I'll say a word about, and the title of this work you'll see there is Repressive Tolerance. It was an essay written in 1965. You can find it on the net. In fact, you can find Eros and Civilization on the net. There's so many books on the net. And when I was researching all this stuff a few years back, I came across most of the works at the Frankfurt School, at least the ones in English, are there just to be read, downloaded, whatever you want. But you can easily read Repressive Tolerance. It's a long essay, but it's not beyond you. But it's also not easy. But anyway, repressive tolerance, what's it about? Well, this expression was Marcuse's way of referring to the kind of tolerance expressed in the famous saying, which was wrongly attributed to Voltaire, but I'm sure you've heard it. It goes like this: I disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. Okay, that's the kind of tolerance that I guess we've traditionally seen as at the heart of liberal democracies. I might disagree with you, but I defend your right to a point of view and your expression of that point of view. And then I'll critique it as well. Well, in Marcuse's view, he says, no, sorry, that might sound good in theory, but in practice, it actually serves the cause of oppression. And you might say, explain, how? He'd say, well, because the stupid opinion, even the evil opinion, is treated with the same respect, at least in terms of being given airtime, as the intelligent opinion, or the righteous opinion. And that's true. Yeah, in that view of tolerance, all ideas get a hearing, even the really silly ones. But Marcuse says, no, sorry, that's not good enough, because that's actually going to be confusing and indeed oppressive. And the only way to overcome that problem, he says, is by censorship. Even, this is a quote, pre-censorship. I don't know how you do that, but without getting inside people's heads. But anyway, here's how he explains it. He says, liberating tolerance, and which is his idea, he says the other old tolerance is repressive. His tolerance, which is actually repressive, he calls liberating tolerance. So it's a kind of, messing with your head thing. But anyway, he says, liberating tolerance cannot be indiscriminate and equal with respect to the contents of expression, neither in word nor in deed. It cannot protect false words and wrong deeds which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. Society cannot be indiscriminate where the pacification of existence, where freedom and happiness themselves are at stake. Here certain things cannot be said, certain ideas cannot, he says, be expressed, certain policies cannot be proposed, certain behaviour cannot be permitted without making tolerance an instrument for the continuation of servitude. In the same section of the essay, Marcuse goes on to say that in practice, this liberating tolerance basically means, here's a quote, intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. Gee, didn't see that coming. All right, so it's very discriminating and indeed very repressive, but supposedly liberating. Well, let's come back to critical theory. I said we'd say a bit more about that. So here we are, point number C on the outline. So there's a lot more, of course, we could say about Marcuse, and we've said almost nothing about Horkheimer and Adorno, let alone other members of the school. But it's worth saying a bit more about critical theory, because this was the kind of chief collective enterprise of at least the first generation of the Frankfurt School. Okay, the Frankfurt School goes on, but it's changed dramatically over the years, and a lot of helpful stuff has come out of the Frankfurt School. So don't think Frankfurt School terrible. Well, certainly some terrible stuff, I think, came out of Marcuse's mouth and pen. But anyway, so just be aware, there's several stages, generations of the Frankfurt School. We're talking here about the early years, the first stage, and critical theory being the collective enterprise of the school in those years. Now, as I said before, critical theory was basically a form of sort of social critique aimed at undermining, well, capitalism fundamentally, but anything that was deemed oppressive, and advancing communism fundamentally, and anything that would promote it. It was designed to change society, as we said, and so it stood opposed in Horkheimer's mind to what he called traditional theory, which again, as Marx had put it, just goes about explaining society, whereas critical theory is about changing society, okay? So not to explain only, but ultimately to change. Now, what must not be missed, however, is that critical theory is, and they were very clear about this, it's essentially a negative exercise. It's intentionally destructive and only accidentally constructive, if at all. I mean, the idea, it's basically tear the house down is the idea. No idea how to build a new one, just it has this kind of assumption that if you tear the old one down, magically the new one will appear in its place. Okay, so it's a destructive, negative exercise, long on trenchant, unremitting criticism of any aspect of Western culture that was deemed to be dehumanizing, and very short on solutions or alternative proposals about how to actually make something better. But it did the job, at least for many, and continues to do the job, at least for many, of convincing people that, well, here's the way that philosopher John Gray puts it, convincing people that the West is uniquely malignant, the ultimate source of injustice and oppression throughout the world, and Western power and values essentially illegitimate. Okay, so it's a form of, well, cultural self-hatred in that sense, or civilizational self-hatred, that just sees everything that's come out of the West as terrible. Now, I've got a little bit of sympathy for the Frankfurt School, right? Because remember, these guys were Jews in Nazi Germany. And they saw Nazism as kind of almost the product of, the end point almost of Western developments. Now, were they right to see it that way? No, I don't think so. But I kind of get it. That was their perspective. And they really, I think, quite paranoid. So if you want to talk about conspiracy theories, I think critical theory is a conspiracy theory because it just sees the devil everywhere in Western culture rather than a fair read of this was good, this was not, this was wonderful, this was terrible, right? It's not that kind of fair-minded analysis. But anyway, let me say a word about the impact of the Frankfurt School, because I'm going off script and that'll only push my time longer than I want, because I'm meant to be finishing like now. There's a German journalist named Robert Grosinger who has likened the impact of the Frankfurt School to The Sorcerer's Apprentice, if you know that poem by Goethe, or if you've seen Fantasia and seen the cartoon version. But for this journalist Grosinger, one line in Goethe's poem is particularly poignant, where it says, "The spirits which I summoned I now cannot get rid of." And he sees the Frankfurt School like that. They set in motion spirits or hobgoblins, or, well, in real life, the 68ers, right? The people who are involved in the 60s revolution at various levels, but particularly the student rebels. And, well, the fact is, most of the Frankfurt School became increasingly appalled by what was happening, supposedly as a result of their ideas. And certainly that was the case with Adorno. I mean, Adorno was absolutely horrified by the student rebellion of the 60s. And in 69, in an interview, he said, "When I made my theoretical model, I could not have guessed that people would try to realize it with Molotov cocktails." And he called the police on the student rebels at one point, which didn't earn him a lot of congratulations from them. But here's the thing, Marcuse, different story. He was a fan. He encouraged the riots and the rebels. Indeed, in the Paris riots of 68, students marched through the streets with banners that had on them Marx, Mao, Marcuse. And so he was a bit of a pin-up boy for, the student rebels at least. And his impact has gone on way beyond. As one writer has put it, we live in Marcuse's world. You didn't know that, perhaps, but you do, in many ways. And the reason for that is because he tutored a generation, as one writer puts it, a generation of young radicals who, after the 60s, gained a toehold in tenure by writing university press books and basically themselves teaching generations of students that followed them the kinds of ideas that they had received. Here's how Grosinger puts it in his article on this, which I think is on the bibliography on the handout there. He says, "They and their later progeny are endowed with the sense of mission and the illusion of being on the right side of moral righteousness. In thousands of more or less important but always influential positions of authority, they succeed in injecting entire generations with a disgust for their own culture and history. With their alleged liberating tolerance, they have torn down natural or culturally nurtured inhibitions and replaced them with state-enforced prohibitions on thinking and acting. These, in turn, have almost completely destroyed the natural workings and defense mechanisms of a healthy society. In short, he's not a fan. All right, now I've got some more material here, but I think maybe, given the time, it's a good point to stop. What do you think, Charles? I do have some points, I guess, of Christian response, which perhaps we'll kind of pick up within the question time. So let's move straight there, shall we?
Sounds good.
Whoop.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Heaps in there. Heaps in there to think on and mull on. I'm going to grab my stool out. You grab a stool. Now you grab the legs.
Maybe, yeah.
Now, there's a sense in which you've given us part of the history and the story of where our culture has landed. And it's a long and it's a complicated kind of history with people that kind of came up with ideas that sound strange to us, and yet they've kind of mutated and have now landed in our culture, and it now shows up in the air we breathe. And so, in a sense, I think this Q&A would be a helpful thing to, in a sense, take some of what you've given us and then kind of go, well, how does this land in our culture? And how can you spot these things? G'day, Tim.
Sorry, I didn't tell Isaac that I needed a microphone. I'm mostly just a prop anyway.
So, yeah, there's a sense in which we go, okay, we've got this stuff, and what does it look like in our culture? How do you spot this thing? And there's a sense in which I reckon once you see this, you can't unsee it, and you see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And in a sense, you said we live in Mark Hughes' world, and imagine a bunch of us might not have heard of Mark Hughes before this, and yet once you see the fingerprints, you can't unsee them. And so, let me perhaps kick off this way. They understood the world in terms of oppression. Everyone is either oppressed or they're an oppressor. And, for Marx, he understood that in terms of economics. You've either got heaps of money or you got none. But these guys, they took that and understood it in terms of culture and identity. And they said, it's not so much about economics, it's about who you are and identity. And kind of Marcuse, he took that and made it sexual, which is why our culture actually has a lot of discussion about sexual identity. It's these kind of fingerprints. But as you said, there was, I think it was Gramsci. He said that they want to influence universities, churches, clubs, because they recognise that people think at the popular level, people think at ground level. Yeah. And so they wanted to get down there and influence. So I guess just at a top level, where do you spot some of these fingerprints at the popular level?
Yeah, well, I guess many people have talked about I guess, again, for want of a better descriptor, the woke movement as kind of Marxism 3.0, right? So original Marxism, 1.0, the kind of the cultural Marxism of, the last century, 2.0, and then woke is kind of a development of that. It's an outgrowth of both Gramsci and Marcuse, dependent on those two individuals. Of course, there are many more players in the mix that we haven't even talked about, and that's okay. And there's lots of other factors in the mix too, like social media and just the internet age itself. So there's a whole lot of feeders to, I guess, the current contemporary scene that as we find it. So you're asking what in the midst of that?
Where do we see this at a popular level? Like, where can we see some of the influences?
Oh, well, there's a myriad of ways, I guess, in the pressure to affirm nonsense, like, trans women are women. That's nonsense. Trans women are trans women. They're not actual biological females. There's a bit of new speak, to use the Orwellian term, that if you don't buy it, then you're an oppressor. So I've just said something oppressive. I've said it's just something hateful. I'm a bigot. And so I deserve punishment. I deserve whatever to be corrected. But again, there's very little forgiveness in this new religion either. So it doesn't seem there's no kind of way out really for those who are the condemned.
Which is what Mark Hughes has said. He said liberating tolerance.
Yeah.
Actually, ideas can be harmful. And so you need to actually shut those ideas down. And
Yes.
what you just said was, in a sense, an example of what kind of he was talking about there.
Yeah, it is. I threw it out there because it's confronting, because it now sounds offensive to our ears. It sounds offensive to my ears. But that's just because we are swimming now in this kind of cultural ether. People are telling me every day, they're pressured now to put their pronouns on their Zoom screens or whatever it is. That's all. Again, that's all virtue signaling to say, hey, I might be in the oppressor class, but I'm an ally. Okay, so don't hate me. Don't kill me yet. Eat me last, whatever.
Please send in your questions. QR code will come up on the screen. Please send in your questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So this is from the Slido, and it's one I want, and they're basically saying, can you finish your talk? So how should Christians respond?
Yeah.
I think they want more, I want more. I'd have happily sat there. So can you just...
I'm happy to finish the talk, but...
give us the
probably
slightly shorter version. I'd happily hear it.
Yeah, well, look, let me do that, partly just by grabbing what I didn't cover, and just so I can have that as a reference for my sake. There's a number of slides I've actually got, like this one that's just popped up. Did I put that there? Or Isaac did it? I don't know. I've put together some of these charts, which again, you can distribute if you wish, just contrasting classical Marxism and cultural Marxism, and in this chart, Christianity. But let me just pull another one up here, where I've got a slightly different contrast with classical, cultural, and, contemporary or woke. And you'll see again I suppose the different answers to the question, where's this, what's the problem, what's the solution, what's the hope, what are the ethics, who are the agents of change, and that kind of thing. What's the other one I've got here? Okay, well, that's again just contrasting today with, again, the Christian message. So, I guess the fundamental thing to understand is that all of these forms of Marxism are, in a way, substitute gospels. They're kind of levering off Christian themes, redemption ideas, liberation ideas, emancipation ideas. And they're using biblical language of oppression and injustice, and these the Bible's been hammering these themes, long before Marx ever thought of them, right? And so, as many people have pointed out, Marxism, in all of its iterations, is really a parody of the gospel, but it's a very dangerous one because it sounds appealing. Again, it promises heaven, right? It's a utopian. And yet it delivers hell, and so it's actually a false gospel, with a false prophet and a false scripture, but it's very seductive for people. And so we've got to realize as Christians, actually, no, we've got the real thing. We've got the true answer. We've got the better diagnosis that goes deeper than simply economic oppression or even sexism or racism. And as real as these sins are, there's a deeper problem still, which is the problem of human evil and God's wrath against our sins and the judgment that is ahead. That's fundamentally what we need to be redeemed from. Now, we also need to be redeemed from all the outworkings of that in terms of all the manifold forms of sin and evil and wickedness and exploitation and all the ugly isms. But they're downstream of the fundamental redemption that only Christ can provide. And so we, as Christians, it's not that we say we've got nothing to learn from, the Marxist tradition or any other. There are always things to learn, but in the end, we've got to remember we actually have the better story, the truer diagnosis, and the final answer that is not there.
Yeah, because there is a sense in which all this is responding to some kind
Something.
of...
Yeah.
But it's kind of diagnosis and solution are a false gospel.
Yeah. And so hence, everything's back to front, its form of tolerance is actually intolerant. Right? Its form of inclusivity is actually profoundly exclusive. Its form of diversity is actually, it's all muddled in that sense.
I'm just going to ask a question. I'm going to call a spade a spade.
Yeah.
Up the front here, we have 3 white, heterosexual, cisgendered, married, Christian men. What would...
That's way too many privilege points for one platform. Isn't it? Yeah.
So somebody could look at us and just go, you're just grumpy white men who are losing your grip on power.
Yep.
And so you're complaining.
Yep.
What do you say to that?
Well, in one sense, all the first bits are true, right? Unavoidable. But it is a reminder, our business isn't fundamentally to complain. I mean, it's one thing just to, as it were, understand our context and the pressures and contours of that. But at the end of the day, it's business as usual for the Christian. We get on loving our neighbours and serving the Lord and preaching the gospel in season and out of season, and ready to suffer and expecting persecution, because that's being Christian. And yes, okay, we see where we can sort of find common ground, common cause with people in things, but we work out how to speak helpfully into situations and again show a better way, live a better way, but also speak of a better way. So in one sense, it's just, I do think we need to understand our times as best we can, but it really doesn't change fundamentally what we're called to do. It may nuance the way we do it, but our core business remains our core business.
Rob, if I were to try and inhabit the social justice, the cultural Marxist, the critical theorist, if I would put myself in their mind, you said one of your critiques was that it's ultimately deconstructive. It's all about destroying and not providing anything to, propose as an alternative to put up in its place. I found myself wondering, would they agree with that diagnosis, and would they say, well, hang on, that's not true. We are deconstructing. We're trying to destroy the injustice. We are trying to, like the classical Marxists, we're trying to distribute the wealth evenly. You guys have way too much, what do you call it, capital points, culture points? Privilege points.
Yeah.
Where our vision of the utopia is taking your privilege points and giving it to those who don't have as much. Our vision is actually, we're trying to rebuild something. We're trying to take away injustice, have equality, and those. How would they say something different? What's your thought on that? Or how would you say, but that's not right?
Yeah, first of all, my criticism is primarily of the kind of Frankfurt School critical theory tradition, which they were very pessimistic and really didn't have a lot of solutions. Now, others, of course, have come along with all kinds of social programs and suggestions about what to do and how to redistribute wealth and fix this and that and the other. And some of those ideas may be good ideas, and others may be absolutely crazy. And so there again, I think, okay, we ought to be open to listening to ideas and solutions and making changes. And again, we can make all kinds of common cause with people who maybe don't share our convictions at all, but maybe have a brilliant idea about how to address this particular social problem. Well, I think that's part of Christians being engaged in the world and loving our neighbours and being part of those discussions and decisions. So I don't see a problem there where there are actually genuine solutions being put on the table that may have merit and be worth attempting. I guess what, again, often characterises this tradition is an optimism. Well, both are two things really. One is a kind of, again, to use that word, demonising of everything before, and then an optimism that it's going to be paradise on earth if we do this. And that is always a bad sign, right? It just never works out well. So the best change is nearly always incremental. And, as many have discovered and said rightly, politics is ameliorative and not redemptive. It patches things up, but it doesn't. It's not an ultimate cure, and never can be. So it's that kind of utopian thinking that if we just do this, there'll all be unicorns and rainbows, and we'll be away. That's where we all get nervous. Anyway, that's a bit of a vague answer. I'm sorry, but yeah.
I've just been looking through some of these questions. There are some really fantastic ones. Can I?
Yeah, go for it.
I'll just throw a bunch of questions your way.
Yeah.
Inverting the pyramid sounds a lot like the first shall be last.
Yeah.
Was Jesus a Marxist?
Yeah. Well, that's right. This is where this tradition has a number of resonances with biblical teaching. And God is going to bring down the lofty and raise up the humble. And the first will be last, the last will be first. So there is, I mean, Marx knew his Bible. I mean, his family's Jewish, and his father converted to Christianity in order to keep practicing as a lawyer. Marx is brought up as a Christian. So he's got a head full of biblical ideas. But he tries then to leave the gospel behind and God behind. And so, again, this is why I think some of these ideas, well, at one level you can say, yeah, that's right. Marx was right to be angry about that. He was right to be concerned about this. There's a genuine injustice here that needs to be looked at and addressed in some way. And yet at the same time realize that once you take God and the gospel out of these things, you're going to create something almost always worse than This is the thing. The solutions actually create worse problems than the problems the solutions were designed to solve.
And round we go.
And there's world history. Yeah.
I've got a question for you. This one says, hasn't Marcuse on repressive tolerance been proved right in the era of fake news? The free dissemination of harmful ideas has led to immense social discord.
Well, it has. I mean, there's always been fake news. I mean, people have been spreading rumours and false reports since
the disciples stole the body.
They could speak, yes.
Being an example, by the way, not something that... Anyway.
Yeah, we are in a new phase of human history in this internet world, post-social media, where so much information can be disseminated so quickly and so convincingly, and, well, things manipulated in a way that you could easily believe, okay, so, war was declared by this country, so it is a dangerous time. Now, I don't know the solution to that is then to have state-controlled media that's got riddled with dangers, and but exactly how we navigate the way forward from here, I don't know. But somehow we have to, I guess, just get habituated in not believing everything we see and hear, and understand how the algorithms work and how they suck people down these rabbit holes of reinforcement and so on, and outrage. So we've got to wise up to what the internet is doing to us, not just what we are doing with it, and what our devices are doing to us, not just what we're doing with them. And I think it's going to take us, I don't know how many decades to kind of find a way through that. And if and when we do, there'll probably be some new challenge of equal complexity for us. So it's tricky.
Can I ask a follow-up? I feel like you're going to try and end it. I just want to...
No, I had more questions.
Very good. I want to ask a follow-up. This is my own. Is Marcuse, or is that work, repressive tolerance, is that the origins of the idea of speech as not just offensive but harmful? Like today we've got this idea you can't say certain things because certain things are not just I don't like them, but they're actually harmful to who I am, and we need to be safe, and we're trying to create safe spaces. Does it go back there? Where does that idea come from?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there's a sense in which speech has always had the power to harm up to a certain point. But I guess it's the equation of physical harm with the words now seen to kind of do a violence, be an instrument of violence in the way that violence is, So it is one of the ironies of our time that speech is violence, and yet silence is also violence. It's hard to know how they go together. But then violence somehow is okay. Particularly if someone uses their speech violently, then you can be violent to them, that's okay. So it's very messed up. So I do think, freedom of speech is enormously important, which doesn't mean that all speech is safe, or that speech can't hurt people, or that there shouldn't be some limits on freedom of speech. I think, the classic example, of course, the person who yells fire in a crowded space, that's an irresponsible act that's going to, cause real harm to people, and so therefore a criminal act. But again, we want to have very few, or as few as possible, restrictions on speech, so we can let people express ideas, even if they're stupid ideas.
Yeah, I guess I think we'd all go, yes, the fire in the crowded space idea is silly. We shouldn't let someone do that. But one of the questions I think I saw in here was something along the lines of, is Marcuse the grandfather of cancel culture? So I think cancel culture kind of has this idea of, we can't let them speak these scary ideas, or cancel them from existing, cancel them from speaking, all those sorts of things.
Yeah, sure. I mean, cancel culture is one of the fruits of all of this. Having said that, of course, people have been cancelling each other in various ways forever, sometimes by cutting their heads off, and frankly, the church has done its fair bit of cancelling of people as well. So I guess since the sort of age of toleration, sort of post-Enlightenment, various toleration acts and so on, where we've moved into a more openly pluralistic context, this is bringing back in again a kind of cancel culture we haven't seen for quite a while. And so it is kind of like the Inquisition now. We're back there, but it's a different kind of Inquisition. But so it's just I find myself going round and round. I mean, I'm alarmed by cancel culture, but it's not like we haven't seen it before, and it's not like Christians haven't been guilty of it too. But we're certainly now on the receiving end of it, as is anyone, J.K. Rowling, who dares to challenge the kind of current orthodoxies of the culture.
There are at least 8 questions that I desperately want to ask.
We better hurry.
I think let's finish there.
Yeah.
I want to honour people's time, but I want to invite us to keep talking about these things. If you've asked some of these questions, please keep talking about them, discuss these things, throw them around. Continue to think on these things. So there was heaps in there for what you gave us. But
Can I add one thing? On the handout that some of you have and others of you will get, there's a long bibliography on the back. not only with stuff about tonight's topic, but then a whole lot of Christian literature where, well, of good books and things where talking about Christians engaging with culture.
What's your top pick?
Top pick? Oh, gosh. Probably Steve McAlpine's Being the Bad Guys. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys. Thank you for coming. Thank you for tuning in online. And thank you, Rob, as well.
My pleasure.
This is our last summer nights. So we'll see you Sunday.